So, good evening, everybody. Thank you for attending the latest of the School of Archaeological and Forensic Sciences at University of Bradford guest lecture series. This is the penultimate one of the 2020-2021 series. So thank you for joining us after the Easter break. And this evening, it's a little bit of a strange one for me because it will be myself and Dr. Abby Flint, who you can also see on screen there presenting. So in terms of introduction wise, I will do Abby first. I'm very, very lucky to have Abby working on the Wetland Futures project with me. She's done a huge amount of work over the past year, and hopefully you'll enjoy what Abby has to say about peatlands and Ilkley Moor following various bits of research in the seminar this evening. Abby has done a variety of work outside of archaeology and came back into archaeology for the Wetland Futures project. So hopefully we'll be continuing our partnership for a little bit longer post-project as well. We've got some exciting ideas for continuing the Wetland Futures project into a different format. So fingers crossed that will happen and we can carry on working together. Hopefully you all know myself fairly well. I've done these seminars for 4 years, I think now. But in terms of my research, I'm based around wetland archaeology, which incorporates peatlands as part of that wetland aspect. So moving on to the theme of this evening's lecture, we would like to discuss a project which we've been working on for the past year, but has been running for almost 3 years now, which is the Wetland Futures in Contested Environments project, and focusing a little bit more specifically on the research we've done on a nice local location, so focusing around Ilkley Moor as a research basis for this seminar. In broader project terms, then Wetland Futures is based around understanding European wetland heritage in contested environments. So a much wider project, which actually incorporates 3 different countries, focusing on Ireland, the Netherlands, and the UK, with 7 different case study sites within those countries, funded by the Joint Programme Initiative for Cultural Heritage, and in the UK, that is administered by the Arts Humanities Research Council. The project partners that we have are University College Cork in Ireland and Wageningen University and Research in the Netherlands. Those different case study sites that we've tried to focus on in Ireland are the Irish Midlands, a big peat cutting location. In the Netherlands, the Schokland, the Waddenzee, and the Dutch Fenlands, big landscape environments incorporating UNESCO World Heritage Sites. And in the UK, focusing on Ilkley Moor, nice and local, chosen because of partly because of proximity to Bradford, but also a variety of different aspects occurring in that location. Looking at Thorn and Hatfield Moors, a little bit further afield out into the Humber Head, looking at the peatlands in the Humber Estuary, and finally with Shapwick Heath in the Somerset Levels as our third main case study site from the UK. So 3 very different sorts of environments. We've got a variety of different peatland locations, and we'll come on to the variety of those environments in a short while. But before we go too far into depth, if we talk about peatlands, when engaging with a variety of groups in different locations, particularly around the Irish Midlands, people didn't necessarily understand what we meant by peat or peatlands, even though it's a big peat cutting location. Once you mention bogs and boglands, people actually start to understand what it is you're referring to. So those peaty locations we are considering essentially the colloquial boglands or bog locations, and things which people start to automatically associate with these sorts of environments, peatlands, boglands, in terms of heritage and archaeology, are a really big famous, well-known finds. So we can start instantly thinking about bog bodies because they're very interesting features which really start to capture the imagination of people, because you can see, as we see on the images there, we've got very significant remains with facial expressions left and really great detail in the organic preservation. But these, although there are quite a few of them around in UK, Netherlands, Ireland, they are still quite exceptional finds. They are not a common occurrence of archaeology in peatland or bogland locations by any means. They are very rare occurrences when they do occur. They are found typically by accidental discovery through cutting for other purposes, be it road construction or peat cutting, farming, etc., which uncovers these remains. If we think about briefly why we have these remains occurring in peatland locations and what makes them such a significant resource for archaeology, then we have really good organic preservation because of a variety of different chemical and physical processes occurring in these locations. Firstly, the very nature of peat and bogland areas means they have a slightly acidic pH, so around about malt vinegar sort of pH, which acts as a bacterial decay inhibitor, meaning that bacterial decay is slowed down. It's not entirely stopped, it still will occur, just on a much slower scale. We also have a time factor, a duration factor, in which the peat itself builds up and grows and develops over time as the sphagnum moss, the primary constituent of peat, gradually grows and then is covered by later growth of moss, becoming compressed down and building up over prolonged duration, many centuries and millennia of peat buildup. The third process we have is physical pressure, which is again based around the growth of peat and sphagnum moss building up over time around the archaeological remains, acting to compress materials, thereby removing oxygen from the matrix, acting as a further inhibitor to bacterial decay. So we have very slow decay of organics, creating these exceptional organic remain finds, resulting in features such as the bog bodies. As we have on the right-hand image there, we just see the body emerging from a peat cutting and in the excavation. So we have some exceptional finds. Not all finds from bogs are bog bodies. We do get other organics, significant paleoclimate indicators, significant wooden or artifactual remains occurring as well. And if we look around the extent of the UK from the IUCN UK Peatland programme, then we know that the current extent of peat coverage in the UK is significantly less than it would have been in past and historic and prehistoric time periods. The current map indicates very limited peat extent coverage, particularly in the fenland locations in Cambridge and Norfolk, in the Somerset levels, limited peat coverage, but continuing upland blanket bog coverage, quite extensive in various parts of upland UK. Going back just a few centuries, this peat map would be significantly larger. It would have far greater coverage of peat in the east of England, in the southwest of England, and further into northwestern and northeastern England as well. When we speak about peatlands in the context of Wet Futures and the 3 case study sites that we have, there are 2 forms which we're looking at. Ilkley Moor is primarily a blanket bog, which is peatland occurring in an upland location fed by rainwater. So the water input into the peat is coming from rainwater only, and it acts as a coverage across the landscape. The lowland peat we're looking at, so out in the Humberhead Levels and Shapwick, they are raised bogs. They're slightly different in how they form over time, and these are mounds of peat which build and grow, but again, primarily fed by rainwater, not fed by drainage channels or rivers running through the locations. It is primarily the rainwater acting as the input to the peat growth in these areas. Mostly, they are fairly nutrient inhibited or deprived, so they aren't massively good areas for significant vegetation growth, but that changes over time, and peat is very good for agricultural purposes. It's very fertile, good high organic content. So it doesn't have a huge benefit for live vegetation on the peat area, but it is once it's formed into peat and incorporated into other materials. I've lost my proceed arrow, apologies for a second. There we go. And these peatlands are much more than just the heritage or the archaeology that they contain. There's far greater resources contained in peatlands, in boglands than purely archaeology, which is partly what the IUCN UK peatland programme is there to address, in addition with the conservation needs of peatlands. If we start thinking about the potential benefits of peatland to wider society, then we can start looking into what are called ecosystem services. So it is functions that environmental locations, landscapes provide to an economy based around financial valuation. And they can be a variety of different ecosystem services, cultural or otherwise functional. The common ones which are particularly focused on are carbon sequestration, so removal of carbon from the atmosphere and storage of that into the landscape, thereby aiding in climate change mitigation, because we are removing carbon and greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. And double impact by having healthy peatlands, boglands, we are actively removing through the live sphagnum moss, but by keeping peat intact and not degrading, we are actively preventing the release of historically stored greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So it's a double benefit by having healthy peatlands in terms of storing away carbon from the atmosphere. But we can also look at the benefits for water services. So water filtration is a significant benefit for healthy peatlands. It removes particulate matter from water courses in upland locations, reducing down the impact which we need to have on water filtration systems before proceeding through to drinking water, for example. So we can use the peatlands as natural water filtration services. And we can also use peatlands to mitigate, reduce, prevent flooding, which we'll come on to in a second. Other aspects revolve around the increasing of biodiversity. Plant species, animal species, insect species, all benefits for the environmental services. Then harder to quantify in terms of valuation would be the role of peatlands and boglands in providing mental health benefits through green spaces, wellness benefits from open areas, green spaces, exercisability, as we particularly saw during the first COVID lockdown and people trying to get out and have healthy exercise in the environment. You can also give a little bit more valuation to tourism and the benefits that peatlands bring to localized economies for attracting people into that area. Flooding is one of the bigger things which we can actively see people trying to use peatlands for, particularly around Yorkshire. We had just a few years ago the Boxing Day floods, when I'm sure many of you can remember the significant rainfall and then flash flooding which occurred from Leeds right across into York. One of the potential reasons for that very, very rapid flooding was sheer quantity of water flowing into the main river channels. One of the theories behind mitigation of floods if we can retain much more of that water higher up in the environment, so up in that upland peatland location, then we can reduce down the rapid flow of water to the main river channel, reducing down flash flood risk or potential. Healthy peatlands can act as a sponge and retain water. Degraded peatlands, water just runs straight off the surface and will go right down into that river valley very rapidly. So by retaining more water up in the peat, we have both healthy peat and reduced flooding risk further on down the chain. And if anyone goes up into Ilkley more at present time, there's a number of bits of work which I spotted occurring when I went to do some work last week in preventing rapid erosion channels. So a number of dams have been made from stone to prevent water eroding the peat and then slow it down from going right down into a valley very rapidly. So we can see these actions occurring in mitigating flood risk up in the Ilkley area today. So there's some of the ecosystem benefits which we can get from healthy peatlands and boglands, but historically there are a number of uses to which peatlands, boglands have been put, which are in direct conflict with those ecosystem services, primarily using peat for agricultural purposes, composting, or for fuel. So physically cutting off peat to use that for either burning, which will release all of those greenhouse gases directly into the atmosphere. So not only have we removed it, we're then starting to release historically stored greenhouse gas into the atmosphere. If we use peat for farming, we cut the peat and then it actively degrades as it goes into the ground. So if you're using peat-based compost, you'll notice that every year, every second year, you have to top up with compost in the garden because all the nutrients have gone. And that is because the peat has been degraded and eroded away in the soil matrix in the garden. So number one, peat-based compost is bad and you shouldn't use that anymore. And number two, general farming on peatlands or drainage of peatlands for farming produces a lot of greenhouse gases going out into the atmosphere as well. Historically drained significant proportions of the UK was drained in the 19th and earlier 20th centuries in terms of peatland coverage. But even within these good and bad uses, then there is conflict occurring because in certain parts of the UK, in Ireland, we have traditional use of peat for fuel, and that becomes very much tied to personal identity and heritage of populations, particularly Irish Midlands, and we'll come on to another example from the UK in a few moments. So we do have conflict occurring even within practices which would be seen typically to be bad or negative. There are uses which would traditionally use those for positive purposes. And these are the direct oppositions which we could experience in peatland locations, or one of the direct oppositions or conflicts, contestations in these environments. We have the desire on one hand for conservation. On the other hand, we have the desire for agricultural production, food sustainability. So things which are naturally in conflict. Add into that the historic use, for example, in the UK, we could look at the Isle of Lewis up in the Scottish Islands, and from a Google Maps image, you can see there's no tree coverage on this island, or very little tree coverage. Most of it is peat, which was historically cut on an individual person hand cutting basis for fuel. So cut out from these cutting banks, which you can see in the left-hand image, the rectangles, where households would have their own access to specific locations and temporary rights on the peat to cut that for utilization on a household level scale for burning for fuel. And we can see that occurring from prehistoric times as a fuel use right through to relatively present day times. And it's very much tied into individual household identity. So bringing in conflict between wider conservation interests and household and personal identity, family history and heritage. So part of the Wet Futures project was to research peatlands as well as broader wetlands. We decided to look at peatlands because in reality, there are a lot of conservation programs occurring around the UK and abroad, Ireland and Netherlands, but there's typically very little knowledge or interest in terms of heritage and archaeology from conservation programs. It's almost as though the conservation action trumps the archaeological or heritage interests. So we wanted to try and understand and rectify that within conservation programs. Gives us opportunity to directly engage with these conservation groups, particularly through IUCN UK peatland programme and their conferences and other engagement activities that they occur, but also trying to place heritage and archaeology within the broader framework of ecosystem services and understand how we can start to provide a value for heritage and archaeology in that framework, which is very difficult to do because a lot of the value is quite emotional and doesn't have a huge financial impact. So we mentioned the 3 study areas before. Abby will go on to these in a few moments. I realise I've taken quite a long time on introduction already, but Shapwick Heath is a National Nature Reserve, lowland raised bog, as we spoke about before, with a history of extraction and drainage. But hopefully some of you will have heard of the Sweet Track, which runs through the area as a Neolithic trackway extending across the landscape. Bourne and Hatfield Moors, again a National Nature Reserve out in the Humberhead area. Another lowland raised mire, again with drainage and peat extraction history, again with prehistoric trackways in the location. So some distinct similarities in these areas based around their landscape form, type and heritage which might be occurring there. Also significant paleo-ecological studies occurring out in Bourne and Hatfield Moors, which was partly conducted by some of our project partners from University College Cork. Ilkley Moor, the final case study one we're focusing on mostly. It's a little bit different in terms of landscapes. It's an urban common, so people have general rights to go and graze animals on the landscape. It's an upland blanket bog, so a different form of peatland environment with history of grouse shooting and industry quarrying in the location. And the archaeology that we have is mainly the rock art and the monuments occurring within that landscape. So a different one to the other 2 case studies that we have. And thinking about the more broadly, we have the archaeological interest, heritage interest. We have interest from the conservationist nature, conservationist in terms of animal species biodiversity, but you could counter that with the interests in grouse shooting, so 2 sides of the conflict there. We have other activities which now broadly occur in the location of the moor, so we have lots of people utilising them more for recreation in terms of activities such as walking, but also, as we can see, mountain biking and mountain bike trails going through the area, which is again a potential cause of conflict. But we also need to recognise that Ilkley Moor is only part of the broader Rombolds Moor, with Baildon Moor, Ilkley Moor and Rombolds Moor section itself. We've taken typically colloquially Ilkley Moor to the whole of the area, so not just specifically the Ilkley Moor section. And if we think about the broader heritage of Ilkley Moor, if we go back just a few thousand years, then following the glacial retreat and melting of ice caps, and the moor location itself would look very different to that which we have today. It would have been a forested, wooded area, only undergoing significant clearance and conversion to be more open landscape following agricultural introduction processes and through into the Romanization and construction of the Roman fort in the Ilkley area. So significant changes in that landscape occurring over time. And part of these ideas and thoughts started to come out in the research which Abby was undertaking as part of a project, because if we go back to the very beginning of Wet Futures, the key word which really stands out is the understanding of the heritage. So what can we understand from the heritage of peatland and wetland locations in the UK context and from European context, not just from a straight archaeological perspective, but trying to get to the general populace and general public conceptions of heritage from peatland and wetland locations as well. So I'm going to hand over to Abby now. Apologies, Abby, it's taken me a little bit longer to get through that. But we're going to start off with a short research poem and video which Abby produced. So we'll go through that and then I will mute myself and hand over to Abby. Thank you, Abby.
Saturated with stories. Peatlands blur water and earth, a shape-shifting land where past and present collapse, where nature and culture entangle. If we listen, what story will they tell? This story begins before words, with trees, cleared by people, by climate, to form peat. This story begins with absence from maps, wastelands to be tamed and drained into use, damage that outlasts generations. This story begins with homes on a mire, haunted and dangerous, wild tales of moors as ancient and alien. It's a story of other than human, of black moor dogs, of bottomless depths, of will-o'-the-wisps, fairies that dwell in watery places, where bodies are not lost, but intentionally interred in liminal spaces. This story begins with people, of living and working, burying and remembering, healing, forgetting, walking, to escape. This story is unspoken, needs science to translate what was quietly written in archives of pollen and fragments. This is a story of wilderness managed for water, for carbon, for nature, as a resource for our future. This is a story of balance. On Ilkley Moor, a peaty palimpsest from Neolithic to today, written in traces of settlements and standing stones, rocks carved and circled for reasons unknown, where a giant's wife spilled skirtfuls of stones, giving way to big cats and UFOs, metropolis of hydros, the mountain spa, where a song warns of going out bar tat, and where Darwin came for the water cure. Today, stanza stones are etched with poetry, and ancient paths trace crash sites through sheepfolds to quarries where land was made to work, where commoners hold rights to graze and walk. These stories re-enchant peatlands, stories that are still being written, an unbroken dialogue with more than one voice. Widening the lens changes our view of peatlands as plural, old and new. What future tales will tell of crashed bikes, of curlew, of poetry, of re-wetted bogs? Shared stories make space for shared ownership, where we all play our part in the telling and co-create new kinds of heritage. Peatlands are saturated with stories.
Thanks, Ben, and really nice to be chatting with you all today about peatlands and wetland heritage. I hope you enjoyed that poem. It was an attempt.
You're on mute, Abby, sorry.
Hello, could you hear me at all in any of that?
Just the beginning part.
Okay, let's see if we can get onto the next slide. Oh, there we go. Oh, there we go. So yeah, that poem was a research poem that was based on an article that Ben and I wrote and had published late last year, which we'll give the link to at the end of the slide as well. It's open access, so it'll be the end of the presentation. I joined Wet Futures just over a year ago, as Ben said, and have been working on the qualitative research side of the project. So I think for me, it was an opportunity to really focus on understanding what cultural heritage, not just what it meant to the people in the past who constructed it, but what it means to contemporary society and the role it plays now and in the future. So the focus was to explore the meaning that peatlands have for people, how people conceptualize peatlands and their cultural heritage, and how they use peatlands and the challenges and issues that they think peatlands are facing. So we used a mixed method approach, which had these 4 strands. And I should note that as the research was conducted during the COVID-19 pandemic, it was obviously impacted by that. So this presented ethical and practical challenges for face-to-face research. So we used online and remote methods and looked to make use of existing data wherever possible to avoid placing burden on participants. So the first strand was looking at the academic literature, which that research poem and the article draw on a little bit about all 3 sites. The second strand looks at professional perspectives, so trying to take a bit of a review of policy around wetlands and peatlands, and particularly looking at how cultural heritage is framed in those policies, and a small number of interviews with experts from national organisations that have a role in heritage or peatlands. But the main focus of my work, and what I'm going to talk about more today, is some research into public and local perspectives of peatlands. And again, there were 4 parts to this. So firstly, thinking about what visitors to peatlands think about them. And to look at that, we analysed user-generated reviews from a travel website, from TripAdvisor. And as you can see there, there's a different number of reviews for each site. So for Ilkley Moor, there's over 100 reviews, and then much fewer reviews for Shapwick Heath and Thorne and Hatfield Moors. Secondly, how the 3 sites were represented in the press. So I used a database of newspaper articles to explore coverage of the 3 sites over the last 10 years. And again, you can see that the number of articles varies between the different sites. So a lot more coverage in the press and on TripAdvisor around Ilkley Moor compared to the 2 lowland sites. And because we wanted to explore in depth what peatlands mean to people, we also did some more focused research at one of our sites at Ilkley Moor. So I started with an online questionnaire. We got 74 responses to that. And within that, we asked people to volunteer to take part in in-depth interviews. And I conducted 8 interviews, 8 photo elicitation interviews with people earlier this year, which involved them selecting some photographs of aspects of Ilkley Moor that meant something to them. And that was kind of a starting point for some of the interview questions. So there's a lot more data than I can possibly share in the next 20 minutes. So I'm going to focus on those last 2 parts, the public perspective and the local perspective, and particularly the data from TripAdvisor, press coverage, and the online questionnaire of Ilkley Moor. I'll drop in some insights from the interviews as well, but I'm still analysing that data. So it's very much emerging findings and work in process that we're talking about today. So just to set it in context a little bit, as part of the literature review, I looked at general perceptions of peatlands and also previous studies where people had looked into public perceptions of peatlands. And these, moving forward a little bit quickly. There we go. Sorry, the slides aren't behaving. So I'll talk a little bit anyway about the general perspectives of peatlands that we found from the literature. So this is international literature and tended to focus on the natural or ecological aspects of peatlands. It tended to start from the point that wetlands are viewed quite unfavourably by the general public. And this assumption might be influenced by historical perceptions of wetlands. So, for example, in Ian Simmons' book, he talks about prior to the 18th century, moorlands as being regarded with awe or distaste. They were waste places better avoided. Peatlands also tend to have been framed as dangerous and otherworldly in classic literature. So if we think of Grimp and Mire in The Hound of the Baskervilles, the wild moors of the Brontes, or the dead marshes in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. And this might link back to traditional folklore that's associated with peatlands. So, for example, we've got things like will-o'-the-wisps luring unwary travellers to their doom, bottomless depths, and peatlands as a place to encounter supernatural figures like witches, giants, and fairies, all point to the dangerous and the liminal. But this isn't a consistent picture. So some of the studies that I looked at suggested that people who use peatlands or live locally to them might have more favourable opinions of this landscape. So it might be more complex than simply whether or not peatlands are liked or disliked. So this is the picture that our research paints. So just looking at the ratings from TripAdvisor, we can see that actually visitors hold very positive views of peatlands. And this is reflected in the language that people used in their reviews as well. In TripAdvisor reviews, people use metaphors of treasure to describe peatlands, that are must-see attractions. And in the press coverage and the visitor reviews, all the sites are noted as important regionally, nationally, and sometimes internationally, most commonly for the nature, but some mention the cultural heritage. So, for example, a piece in the Yorkshire Post describes Ilkley Moor as part of one of the most archaeologically rich areas in Europe, with stone markings carved before the pyramids were built. And the people who completed our questionnaire on Ilkley Moor also tended to have very positive perceptions of the peatland of Ilkley Moor. As you can see on the comments from the right, both natural and cultural heritage were seen as important as to why Ilkley Moor was positively perceived. So in terms of how people defined peatlands and how they thought about the cultural heritage, as a first point, I should say that there was much more recognition of the natural rather than the cultural heritage across all 3 sites. And especially when we compare the upland and the lowland sites, there was more emphasis on natural heritage at the lowland sites. There's also a little bit of blurring of natural and cultural heritage, as is evident in this quote from an article about Shapwick Heath, where it talks about what you would perceive to possibly be natural structures like lakes are actually a result of peat digging. So there's some recognition that these are semi-natural landscapes that have been shaped by human activity. And in the Ilkley Moor questionnaire, when we asked people to describe the kind of heritage that they generally associate with wetlands, 45% of people emphasised natural heritage in their comments, 23% cultural heritage, and 29% both natural and cultural heritage. So there's not a neat division between the two forms of heritage in how people see these landscapes. That aside, where cultural heritage is mentioned, what kind of things did people associate with these sites? Well, cultural heritage is mentioned in around a quarter of the reviews for Shapwick Heath and Ilkley Moor on TripAdvisor, and only 10% of the reviews for Thorn and Hatfield Moor. But within this and the press coverage, there tends to be an emphasis on the visible and physical heritage of peatlands. So prehistoric features like the reconstructed sweet track at Shapwick Heath, the scheduled Neolithic trackway at Thorn and Hatfield, and the rock art on Ilkley Moor, alongside things like historic buildings, contemporary monuments and artworks. Also some recognition of traces of past land use, so quarries, disused mines, evidence of peat extraction. Within the newspaper coverage of Ilkley Moor, we do see a little bit of a mention around the less tangible heritage, especially in relation to the song on Ilkley Moor Batat, folklore relating to Rombold the Giant, for whom the larger area is thought to be named after, and some local traditions like New Year's Day dips into the White Wells plunge pool. And the image on the right-hand side of the screen shows people's general awareness of different aspects of cultural heritage of Ilkley Moor from the questionnaire. So what we're looking at really is the blue and orange colouring, which indicates where people reported knowing a lot about or a bit about a different aspect of heritage. It's a mixed picture, I'm not going to talk about it all, but in general, people tended to be more aware of the visible, physical aspects of peatland heritage, the archaeology, the historic buildings and trackways, and contemporary monuments. But an aspect of cultural heritage that's emerging in the analysis from the interview data, the questionnaire data, and in newspaper coverage, particularly around Ilkley Moor, is the idea of cultural heritage as a dynamic process. So not just about objects and sites, but something that's living and evolving. And in part, this was framed in a way of thinking about the continuation of human presence in the landscape from prehistory to today. But also a couple of people in interviews spoke about their own part in cultural heritage. So being part of a longer tradition of recreational use of Ilkley Moor since its history as a Victorian spa resort, or passing down family traditions like foraging for bilberries. So there's a sense of continuity of significance of the landscape, even if the nature of use or the type of significance has changed over time. So in the visitor reviews and press coverage, all three sites were described as being used in a range of ways, but recreational activities dominate across all three sites. They take a slightly different flavour at each site. So at Ilkley Moor, it was very much walking and other outdoor pursuits that were emphasised, whereas at the two lowland sites, it was walking and nature tourism, especially bird watching, that were emphasised. And in the Ilkley Moor questionnaire, 90% of people who completed the questionnaire said that they used the moor for walking, with smaller percentages for other recreational uses. Within the press coverage, we also see some other types of activities that are included there in that diagram. So things like nature conservation and volunteering, education and public engagement, and in regards to Ilkley Moor as a working landscape for grazing sheep, and as a location for arts and sports events, filming, and even a site of political protest. And I think this quote from one of the participants of the Ilkley Moor questionnaire really illustrates quite nicely that people often use peatlands for multiple reasons. And I think this is important for us to bear in mind when we're thinking about trying to compare different public perspectives on peatlands. It's not as simple as what people who walk on peatlands think compared with people who engage in conservation activities. Actually, many people have multiple interests in and uses of these landscapes. So what role did cultural heritage play in these active uses of peatlands? For some, it was a driver of spending time in the landscape. So 41% of respondents to the Ilkley Moor questionnaire said that history and archaeology was one of the reasons for their interest in Ilkley Moor, about the same percentage for those that said they had an interest in nature and conservation. For others, they tended to be more points of interest or waypoints on walks, places to aim for. So overall, not the main focus for people's use of peatlands, but added interest and enjoyment for those who mentioned it. But the way that people engage with peatlands isn't just through activities. Our research indicates that people are also engaging with peatlands experientially, emotionally, and intellectually. So in some newspaper coverage, visitor reviews, and in the interviews from Ilkley Moor, people mentioned the multisensory experience of being in peatlands, the sounds of water and nature, the smell of peat and bracken. Having a sense of space was also a theme for Ilkley Moor, with it being a very exposed upland area. It's not really surprising, but it was described evocatively by one interview respondent as being close to the sky. And there might be a link there with the well-being benefits of peatlands. An emotional engagement with peatlands was implied in around 3/4 of the reviews for Thorne and Hatfield and Shapwick, and over half the reviews for Ilkley Moor on TripAdvisor, mainly through the use of positive adjectives, so things like describing the landscapes as lovely, stunning, amazing, spectacular. And some people even used love to indicate a really strong personal attachment. This can have a flip side. A couple of interview participants talked about feeling angry or fearful when speaking about potential threats to Ilkley Moor, like moorland fires. So it's clearly a place that people are personally invested in. And this strong sense of attachment really comes through in the Ilkley Moor data as well. From the questionnaire, a couple of quotes. "It's where I was born and where I identify as belonging. It's where generations of my family have played, socialised, exercised, and reflected." So trying to explore what role cultural heritage plays in this emotional engagement, it's quite hard to pull that out from general perspectives on the moor, but it does feature in some participants' favourite places, and some people in the interview data did talk about cultural heritage sites as evoking emotional responses in terms of being quite magical and mysterious places. Where we see cultural heritage playing a bigger role is in how people engaged intellectually with peatlands. And this was only mentioned in a few of the visitor reviews and press coverage. But for example, in an article for The Observer in 2016, Alice Roberts says of the Sweet Track, "As we talked about Neolithic life out on the marshes, we heard a bittern booming in the distance. The deep past felt very close at hand in this liminal landscape." So this is a theme that's more present in the in-depth data for Ilkley Moor, where the cultural heritage is described as evoking a sense of time depth, prompting reflection, and sparking people's curiosity to find out more. So one participant said, "I just love to see the stuff that they carved on these rocks, which is apparently about 4,000 years ago, and that I'm looking at today, and I'm trying to work out what was in their minds and why did they do it there." And in the questionnaire and interview data, some people also talked about taking an academic interest in the cultural heritage of Ilkley Moor. So doing personal research into the history and archaeology, sharing their knowledge formally by writing guides and walks, and informally by talking to visitors and showing friends and family the rock art. So going back to what Ben was talking about in terms of ecosystem services, we can see that this is kind of reflected in the data in the way that people talked about the value and benefits of peatlands. So I'm just going to pick two out here because all of the ones that are on the screen there were present in the data to some extent. But I think a couple that were particularly interesting in the data were the well-being benefits. So almost 60% of respondents to the questionnaire on Ilkley Moor indicated that they were interested in spending time on the moor for physical and mental well-being reasons. And this was echoed in comments and in the interviews and a couple of the TripAdvisor reviews, where people talked about it providing tranquility and escape from stress and anxiety. It's difficult to explore the role of cultural heritage in this. It's more about the peatland as a whole. But one questionnaire respondent did talk about researching and looking for the rock art on Ilkley Moor during lockdowns and how that had been a sanity saver. And certainly that sense of time depth does prompt reflection and a sense of perspective. The other aspect of perceived benefits that I'm quite interested in exploring more in the data is this social community benefit. The fact that peatlands were viewed as very much a social landscape, where people were spending time with friends and family, sharing activities and experiences, and taking part in community activities like volunteering or going to events. And some indicated that spending time on Ilkley Moor, in terms of the interview data, some people indicated that it linked to different phases or events in their lives. As one interview described it, Ilkley Moor is the backdrop to my life. So beyond such individual comments, it's hard to unpick the role that cultural heritage plays in this sense of belonging and identity, but it's something I'm looking at more in the analysis as it goes forward. So Ben touched on some of the conflicts around peatlands earlier, and exploring the contested nature of peatlands is an important focus within the Wet Futures project as a whole. So what tensions were identified in the public perspectives? Well, the first one was recreational overuse, not recreational use per se, but heavy use and visitor numbers that were thought to be causing erosion and damage. And in some cases, specific activities that were perceived as more contentious or causing damage, such as mountain biking on Ilkley Moor and dog walking on all sites to a certain extent. And associated with that were ideas about right and wrong ways to use the moor. So there was inappropriate behaviour, things like littering, vandalism, crime, bad parking and barbecues that were seen very negatively and seen as very inappropriate behaviour for peatlands. And particularly now we can understand why, with wildfires in the moorlands going on at the moment, that barbecues are a really big concern. And within this recognition, there's an element of peatlands being perceived as fragile and rare environments that need protection and active management. Another area of tension that came out, particularly in the newspaper coverage, was around the impact of managing peatlands for different uses. So over the last 10 years in newspaper coverage, there was quite a lot about the management and use of sites, particularly at Thorn and Hatfield around horticultural peat extraction, and on Ilkley Moor around the management of the moor for grouse shooting. Both activities have now stopped, but they were the subject of quite a lot of media attention at the time. So there's this idea of a challenge in terms of how to balance the competing demands on landscapes, peatland landscapes, in terms of their management that come out through the data as well. One of the tensions that wasn't mentioned by many people, but I think is an important theme for us within archaeology and heritage, is in terms of what counts as cultural heritage and what was worthy of preservation or protection. So, for example, one of the interview participants spoke about whether or not the evidence of past drainage works on Ilkley Moor should be preserved as part of the heritage. They said, some of the things that have been done, like draining all the moors, it's now understood isn't a good thing to have done, so I wouldn't want to retain that just because it's there. And other areas of contested heritage were flagged up in newspaper articles and in interviews. So, for example, some opposition or objection to a landscape project where poetry carved in stones, the stanza stones project on Ilkley Moor. There was some opposition to that from a local Druid group that was described in newspaper reports. Some interviewees reflected on whether or not grouse shooting should actually be considered as part of the cultural heritage of the moor, or reflected on whether contemporary additions to rock art should be perceived as a continuation of that prehistoric activity that's continued with the Victorian graffiti, or whether it's modern vandalism. So I think that last point really speaks to what we understand heritage to mean, not just about the physical artifacts and structures, but about heritage as a dynamic process, and that activities in the recent past and present are contributing and changing that growing cultural heritage. So I'm just going to finish up with flagging a couple of the sort of summary points that emerging or seem to be emerging from the analysis. As I say, it's a work in progress. So there tends to be more emphasis on the natural rather than cultural heritage in current public perceptions of wetlands, but these seem to be quite entangled. So how can we take a more holistic approach to thinking about peatland heritage? There seem to be some differences in how the upland and lowland sites are perceived from looking at the TripAdvisor data and the newspaper coverage. Need to explore this more in the analysis, but it may suggest that any approaches to addressing conflict in peatlands might need to be different for different sites. There tends to be more emphasis on the visible cultural heritage, and it's clear that for some sections of the public, that cultural heritage captures their interest and curiosity, and also that these are meaningful places, both at the individual and community level. Again, we need further research into the role that cultural heritage plays in that, and that's something I'm going to try and unpick as we go on through the analysis. And I think it's also important to explore the impacts that some of those tensions we discussed might have on the cultural heritage of peatlands. In some cases, there are direct risks through things like erosion and fires, but the tension around what counts as heritage might also be quite a productive tension, providing alternative narratives of peatland heritage and opening up conversations about what that means, what should be preserved and why. And again, that goes back to that first point I mentioned, that the narratives that we share about peatland cultural heritage not only shape how we think about the past, but how we understand what this means for the present and how that impacts what's preserved and how it's viewed in the future. So I'm going to hand back over to Ben now.
Thank you, Abby. That was really, really interesting and really good good overview of some of the findings there. So before I just bring us up to a quick summary of our Abby's done a far better summary than I had in my mind there for this slide. Do please feel free to drop any questions you might have into the Q&A box, and then once I've done the summary, we will we'll go through some questions. I can see you've dropped one in there, Joe. Thank you. That's a great question, and we'll come to that in a short while. But do please drop some more in there. I think I've got an 8 flashing up, which I can't quite see yet. I'll get to it shortly. That might mean there's questions in another box. But when I tried to click on that, it wrested control of the slides from Abby. So I do apologise for that when the slide wouldn't go where you wanted, Abby. I was trying to see what's occurring in the chat box. So just to continue on from Abby's overview findings and emerging themes in analysis slide. If we look forwards, going beyond Wet Futures as a project and out into potentially conservation groups, land managers, land management organisations, which are occurring in peatland and wetland locations, things that we can start to offer back as some more suggestions or collaborative options would be, there is a distinct desire amongst certainly some of the population for further information and knowledge to be presented in these peatland and wetland environments, but not too much information, because part of the appeal to these locations is the mystique around some of the location and the uncertainty around what is there in terms of visible heritage, but also the ability to make their own narratives and understandings of those landscapes. So it leaves space open for personal interpretation as well as the quotation mark authorized knowledge dissemination, which might come from archaeologists or ecologists in terms of management of those landscapes. When we do look at the heritage, and particularly archaeological heritage from peatland locations, obviously the visible remains are quite easily present and has a significant level of understanding amongst the population. Those invisible remains, which are beneath the surface, have less awareness of because they can't be seen, although there is some appreciation, knowledge, understanding of the time depth of these places, and that they aren't static environments. There is an awareness of how they've changed over centuries and millennia in the past from a broader variety of visible, both prehistoric and historic remains, which are there. Feeding into the perceptions of ownership, there are quite strong feelings around what would be the appropriate way to use peatlands. I think strong would be an appropriate term for how some of these have been expressed. Definitely perceptions of appropriate and inappropriate behaviour, or in disrespectful use of the landscape coming through, not just from other members of the public, but also with the management of locations. And as with any variety of open access membership bodies, there can be some conflict between those groups. So for example, walkers and mountain bikers could be in conflict. So management of those routeways would be something to try and identify through the locations, to try and keep people open access to the area, but guided around to give best access and best experience for all users of the location. From a self-reflective perspective, when I went up to Ilkley just before Christmas, at the start of December, with another researcher that's done some work for some project, Tom Sparrow, another member of University of Bradford School of Agricultural and Forensic Sciences. We noticed a drainage channel which had been cut around part of a footpath to allow the reinstallation of that footpath. It becomes very boggy if you know the area of the flagstones going up to the stone circle up on the top. There's a couple of sections which are typically very, very wet, and the flagstones are uneven. When you stand on them, you get wet feet, etc., from the water spraying over top. So a channel had been cut to allow that to be reinstalled as a more solid surface. And there were some bits of wood visible in this cutting, and my instant thought was, it's okay, it's not old. You can see it's clearly modern wood. It's nice planed surface. It's there from when they installed the path. And then a few days later, when I was thinking about this, actually, that is part of the heritage of the moor. It's just part of the recent heritage. So we need to consider, as professionals, as archaeologists, I think a little bit more of the longer term planning. And my area of interest is prehistory, but that doesn't negate the fact that there is still ongoing heritage emerging in these locations, not just physical, but also the intangible aspects which we need to try and access. So the different user groups, the different, on Ilkley Moor, we can think about the mountain biking groups, the rock climbing groups which utilise former quarries. We'll start to build up a variety of different intangible heritage associated to the area, which if we start to proactively record now, we can get a much better understanding and preservation of that record going forwards. Which brings us on to the final direction implication, is that, as Abby said in the poem, then peatlands have multiple stories, and people utilise the area for multiple functions, potentially with some knowledge of heritage, of archaeological interest, but also for just general recreation and unaware of physical archaeological features, even though they're being utilised in that environment. So when lockdown number 1 started back in summer last year, I was still actively doing bits of work on Ilkley for research purposes. So I went to take some footage and videos for research actions, and during that I encountered a number of people running. A lovely running group was going across the area, but utilising the visible archaeology as target points and waymarkers, without identifying them as heritage assets or heritage features. They're just convenient points on the landscape which they can have as a target point to run up to, hit that one, move on to the next point, acting as waymarkers across the moor or individual target locations for specific runs. So repurposing those heritage features to a new function, building up part of the intangible heritage of that location, repurposing the archaeological assets in the environment. So multiple stories, multiple people and multiple functions, I think is one of the key thoughts for me going forwards around peatland locations. And with that, if anyone would like to look at some of the broader work which we've done on the project, particularly looking at Ireland or Netherlands, do feel free to check our project website, which is wetfutures.eu. We have a Twitter handle, which is @wetfutures. There is a link there which I can disseminate via email if somebody wants to drop me a mail, or Abby a mail after the session, to the Saturated with Meaning article, which we published just a few months ago, which is open access, so you can access that article for free. Do let us know if you would like to have that link sent on to the paper afterwards. And I see we've got some more questions in there. I see that's gone up to 10 on that part. So I'll try and open the chat box and the Q&A box and then go through some questions. But thank you very much for your time this evening. Thank you for attending the lecture, and hopefully you've enjoyed the presentation. Thank you, Abby. That was really interesting. Thank you very much. So if I get the question box open, chat box, there we go. Okay. So have you got the chat box or Q&A box open as well, Abby?
I have, yeah.
I can see the one from Joe, which came in. I'll ask this one to you. So great
Yep.
research. Do you have any plans